3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
All right, welcome to Roots of Reality. I'm your host, Ben Baumann, and today I'm going to be talking about the history of why wars happen. So for thousands and thousands of years, our species has engaged in warfare for countless reasons. It is a shameful practice that has existed before even the emergence of human civilization, and one that we continue to struggle with today. Some of the various causes of war include things like fighting for one's cultural legacy. A good example historically comes from the Seleucid-Mauryan War, which began about 2,300 years ago, right after the death of Alexander the Great, whose enormous Macedonian empire fell apart into smaller, separate kingdoms, one of which was the Seleucid Empire led by a former officer of Alexander the Great named Seleucus I. And Seleucus I fought for control of the Punjab region in modern-day India because it was a former territory of Alexander's empire. Thus, for Seleucus I, this war was about preserving the heritage and legacy of Alexander the Great's empire, which he viewed himself as a successor to, an idea which continues to appeal to many conducting wars historically, even in the modern world today. Now, another cause of war is oppression. Throughout human history, battling an authoritarian ruler for greater freedom has been quite common as well. An ancient example of this comes from the Third Servile War, which happened over 2,000 years ago against the Roman Empire when a slave rebellion was led by the gladiator Spartacus. And then there are also wars caused by religion. For instance, in 1095, various Christian European nations sent soldiers to conquer Jerusalem from Muslim control in an event known as the First Crusade. And these types of religious conquests throughout history are quite common, where one person believes that another's religion is inferior and must be defeated, or in this case, people are trying to recapture an important religious site for their faith. However, there have also been some societies that didn't need religion to conquer others. Rather, it was just about building a large and powerful empire, as it was for Genghis Khan, the leader of the Mongol Empire, which was based in what is modern-day Mongolia. And Genghis Khan would start his campaign to conquer large parts of Asia and Europe in the early 1200s, creating one of the largest empires ever. Or another cause of war occurs over resources. For example, during the Beaver Wars in 1640, the Iroquois and Algonquin Native American tribes fought over territory known for having lots of beavers because beaver fur had substantial trade value with the European colonists. And then the next cause of warfare historically, especially in more recent centuries, has been due to differing political beliefs. This was the case in 1921 in Armenia, located in the Caucasus in West Asia, when after World War I, Armenia was an independent nation facing immense pressure from the expanding Ottoman Empire, which had recently committed genocide against Armenians, as well as the expansion of the Soviet Union. And as a result, in 1920, Armenia made a deal with the Soviets to become part of the Soviet Union, having no other choice, losing part of their lands to the Ottoman Empire as part of the deal. Then in 1921, after the Soviet army had left, the Armenians then overthrew the communists, returning their independence before the Soviets would later come back and restore Soviet control. Thinking continually about the Armenians, another type of conflict which has happened even very recently with Armenia was about ethnic tension. Another major cause of wars historically. And for Armenia, this ethnic tension was over a region of the Caucasus called the Nagorno-Karabakh. And in 1988, it led to the beginning of a series of wars over the territory due to this ethnic tension between Armenians and people from Azerbaijan. So historically, this territory was part of the ancient Armenian kingdom going back 2,300 years ago. But it has been invaded several times by various empires led by people like the Romans, Arabs, Ottomans, Persians, and Russians. Anyway, in the early 1800s, it was populated mostly by Armenians and controlled by the Iranian Safavid Empire, who then gave the territory to the Russian Empire. And when the Russian Empire was replaced by the Soviet Union, Armenia won independence for a few years before going back under the control of the Soviets. Thus, it was under Vladimir Lenin's rule that Joseph Stalin was in charge of mapping the boundaries of the different parts of the Soviet Union, and this included Nagorno-Karabakh, which was legally placed as part of Azerbaijan despite being mostly populated by Armenians and historically being part of Armenia. Thus, when the Soviet Union began to fall apart, the people of Nagorno-Karabakh declared they would become part of Armenia, thus resulting in several wars over the territory, including in 2020. And today, it is still internationally recognized as part of Azerbaijan and is still a major source of ethnic tension between the Azerbaijanis and the Armenians. So these are the various types of causes of war that happens historically. But now I'd like to break down the conflict on everybody's mind, which is very complex and kind of brings together a lot of different factors. And this is obviously the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So first off, what is the history between Ukraine and Russia? And how did this tension that exists today that has led to the war today, how did that come about in the first place? So the territory that is modern Ukraine has been controlled by various civilizations throughout history. And the modern day capital of Ukraine, Kyiv, was originally founded in 482 by a group of people known as the Slavs. And later in the 800s, after Vikings came to the region from Scandinavia, the Slavs and Vikings mixed to form what was called the Kievan Rus. This would eventually lead to the Kievan Rus capturing Kyiv and making it the capital of the Kievan Rus in 882. And the Kievan Rus territory included parts of Ukraine, Belarus, and modern-day Russia. However, after the fall of the Kievan Rus in 1242, for hundreds of years, parts of the territory that makes up what is modern-day Ukraine has been controlled by the Mongols, by Poland, which later then became the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The territory has also been controlled by the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Russian Empire, with some parts also being independent at different points in time. And the modern capital of Ukraine, Kyiv, came officially under Russian in 1686. However, after the fall of the Russian Empire in 1918, an independent Ukraine formed after declaring its independence before most of Ukraine, with the city of Kyiv, was taken over by the Soviet Union in 1921, while a part of modern-day Ukraine also became part of Poland, Romania, and Czechoslovakia. Eventually, though, over time, all parts of what is modern-day Ukraine became incorporated into the Soviet Union. Then, finally, in 1991, as the Soviet Union was about to fall apart, Ukraine declared its independence. And from here, over time, Ukraine started to drift more and more towards Europe and away from Russian influence. For example, expressing interest in joining NATO and the European Union, despite some back and forth between Russian and pro-Western politicians who have been battling for political power in the modern era when it comes to Ukraine politically. And later in 2010, the pro-Russian leader Viktor Yanukovych became president of Ukraine, and Ukraine then began moving away from its interest in joining NATO, making deeper connections with the European Union, and instead aligned closer to Russia. Then in 2013, just when Ukraine was close to developing greater ties to the European Union, the Ukrainian president Yanukovych, under pressure from Russia, called off the deal. This then led to protests in Ukraine in 2013, which then turned into huge protests in 2014. And in response, President Yanukovych increased authoritarianism in Ukraine and restricted the ability to protest. And protesters even started to get killed by the police in Ukraine. And the Ukrainian President Yanukovych would then later get impeached by the Ukrainian government and charged with the murder of protesters, forcing him to eventually flee to Russia so he could avoid being arrested. After this, Russia became very upset with Ukraine, and in 2014, Russia would then invade and take over Crimea, which is still legally part of Ukraine, but controlled by Russia. And then later, ethnic Russians, helped by the Russian government, rebelled in the eastern Ukrainian cities of Donetsk and Luhansk. And then in 2017, Ukraine finally makes a deal strengthening ties to the European Union. And in 2019, the Ukrainian president Zelensky gets elected. And then in 2022, Russia invades all of Ukraine, which is where we are today. So all of this then begs the question, why did the Russian government start this invasion to conquer Ukraine in 2022? Because literally just a few weeks ago, before this invasion even took place, the Russian president Vladimir Putin laughed off American accusations that Russia was planning to invade Ukraine and said Russia had no plans to invade Ukraine. And now, after it's already happened and more information is coming out, it's even been reported recently that Russia has been planning to invade Ukraine for a while now. And China had even asked Russia to wait until after the Olympics finished to invade Ukraine. So anyway, when it comes to trying to understand the main reason why the Russian government decided to invade Ukraine in the first place, clearly you can tell just based off that brief history I gave you that there's been some issues for a while. But really, what is the heart of it? Why is there this strong Russian obsession with Ukraine and trying to influence Ukraine? So if you're going to ask what the official Russian government narrative is, there are all sorts of different reasons why Russia felt this was necessary. But the main argument used by the Russian government to justify the invasion is that this is a special military operation to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine, because the Russian government says Ukraine is basically supported and controlled by NATO and was planning to attack Russia, at any moment, and is also committing this genocide against Russian speakers. In reality, though, the main reasons for the invasion of Ukraine are far different than this, because the arguments Russia publicly stated is really meant for the Russian domestic audience, not really the international audience who has access to a wide range of sources. However, based on the recent writing and the recent speeches given by the Russian President Vladimir Putin, it is clear that the main cause is really based on Putin's historical view of Ukraine, as well as his fear of Ukraine having closer ties to the European Union and NATO nations like the United States. For instance, for Putin, Ukraine represents Russian heritage. He believes that Ukraine and Belarus are both crucial pieces of what is historical Russia, that Ukrainians, Russians, and Belarusians are all one people. He also believes that Ukraine isn't a real country and claims that historically it has never been an independent nation. Therefore, when the Soviet Union collapsed, Putin believed Russia lost pieces of Russian territorial heritage. In turn, this is the primary reason for the invasion of Ukraine, which is to restore the territory Putin believes Russia never should have lost, which is why he deems the breakup of the Soviet Union to be one of the greatest tragedies of the 20th century. As a result, for Putin, conquering Ukraine will complete Putin's vision of uniting what he believes to be the Russian peoples of the world, since he already essentially controls Belarus, whose government basically functions as a puppet of the Russian government. And so Ukraine represents that one last puzzle piece to complete his vision of united Russian peoples of the world. However, in reality, despite the common heritage between Russians and Ukrainians, they are not the same people. They speak different languages. After all, Ukrainian is different as a language than Russian, despite its similarities. And parts of Ukraine has existed independently before, and Ukrainian nationalism and identity have historical roots going back to at least the 1800s. Additionally, the territory of modern Ukraine has been controlled by numerous human societies throughout history. Thus, the Russian government view of Ukraine is really just a pseudo-historical nationalistic interpretation of history. Additionally, based on Putin's statement, he also seems to think that many Ukrainians share his vision of Ukrainian history. But since the Russian government's invasion of Ukraine, The opposite has proven true, given how Ukrainians are fiercely fighting the Russian forces, showing overwhelmingly that Ukrainians really want nothing to do with Russia and view them not as some sort of brotherly liberators, but rather as foreign invaders. Now, another factor as to why the Russian government invaded Ukraine is due to the increasing relationship between Ukraine and NATO nations, which has really upset Putin because, again, he can't stand the idea of losing a part of what he considers to be historic Russia to these NATO nations. Also, if Ukraine is successful and a thriving democracy, that also hurts the Russian government's image in their own country. Because then people start to think, okay, why is our country not able to have that level of success and openness and freedom to, criticize the government or whatever? Next, beyond these main causes for the invasion, there have been many wild claims by Russian government media to justify the so-called special military operation, which are really not meant to convince an international audience, as I said before, but rather meant to anger the Russian citizens who only trust Russian government media. And these citizens make up a huge part of the government's support. Some of these conspiracy theories include things like Ukraine is creating nuclear weapons that they're planning to use against Russia, even though Ukraine actually gave up its nuclear weapons in 1994 to Russia, ironically in return for guaranteed security from Russia, which has clearly been violated. But there's no evidence that Ukraine has been working on any nuclear weapons. Another conspiracy being promoted is that Ukraine is this horribly corrupt country and a puppet of the United States. Again, there's kind of a lot of irony here because though Ukraine certainly has corruption issues, as many former parts of the Soviet Union does in Eastern Europe, it is a democracy, unlike Russia, which is unfortunately a country well known for fake elections and lots of censorship and corruption. And the censorship aspect in Russian society has increased drastically since the war began, especially due to the lack of success so far by the Russian military in Ukraine. Therefore, the Russian government has become really worried about the development of a substantial anti-war movement in Russia and has worked hard to ban any anti-war protests and any criticism of the war by forcing non-Russian government media sources to close and arresting thousands of people, and even threatening to put them in prison for 15 years just for saying anything negative about the war. As a matter of fact, there have been even cases where people have been getting their phones searched randomly by police on the streets or at airports. You also have kids as young as 7 being arrested with their parents for protesting, as well as elderly people getting arrested for protesting also. Thus, it seems like Russia really is going back in time to the way things were under the Soviet Union due to the government's fear of any form of dissent. After all, part of the reason why the Soviet Union collapsed was due to the lessening of restrictions on information and free speech. And when people began to learn about all the lies they were told, public pressure on the government became huge. Today, though, in Russia, it appears things are moving back in time, and many Russians are starting to flee the nation now because of the increasing restrictions being implemented. Anyway, the next conspiracy promoted on Russian state media is the claim that the Ukrainian government is being controlled by Nazis who are supported by the United States. Now, though it is true that there are certainly some neo-Nazis in Ukraine, they certainly do not control the government and only make up a small fraction of the population. Also, the president of Ukraine is Jewish, which makes that argument even more kooky, not to mention the fact that Russia certainly has neo-Nazis as well. And in recent events, the Russian government hasn't exactly done itself any favors to give off the impression of being this anti-Nazi fighting force since they recently bombed a Holocaust memorial in Ukraine. Additionally, from a historical point of view, the last time Ukraine was invaded by a foreign country was in World War II by Nazi Germany. Thus, there is some tragic irony that the Russian government claims to be getting rid of Nazis in Ukraine while being the only other nation since World War II to invade Ukraine. Next, there are also many false claims about NATO spreading on Russian TV, especially about NATO aggression and expansion. For example, the claim that NATO is aggressive towards Russia, even though NATO is a defensive alliance meant to protect nations from foreign invaders, and Russia's recent actions are exactly why many nations joined NATO in the first place. Additionally, Russia has its own defensive alliance similar to NATO with a few countries as well, called the Collective Security Treaty Organization. Now, the Russian government has also tried to lay out examples of NATO aggression historically by referring to NATO's involvement in Serbia in 1999, and Libya in 2011, Iraq in 2003, and the ongoing civil war in Syria. For instance, in reference to Serbia, the United Nations had condemned the ethnic cleansing going on in Kosovo against Albanians by Yugoslavia, which modern-day Serbia was a part of. And at this time, Yugoslavia was causing a refugee crisis where thousands of Albanians were being forced to leave Kosovo by Yugoslavia. Thus, because Yugoslavia wouldn't stop ethnic cleansing, NATO ended up getting involved and began bombing modern-day Serbia to get this ethnic cleansing to stop, which eventually did successfully get Yugoslavia to stop and withdraw soldiers from Kosovo, eventually allowing Albanians to return to Kosovo. Now, as for NATO's involvement in Libya, it was the result of a civil war breaking out in Libya against the Libyan dictator Muammar al-Gaddafi to get him to give up power. Gaddafi was known for financing terrorist organizations and having his military attack protesters. In fact, the United Nations had condemned Gaddafi, and the international community called on him to step down from power, which he, of course, refused. Thus, NATO eventually helped rebels overthrow him. In terms of Iraq, NATO nations overthrew dictator Saddam Hussein, who was infamous for killing thousands of his own people. And the reason why some NATO nations ended up going into Iraq was based on the belief that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction and supported terrorist organizations. The support for terrorist organizations was true, though no clear link was ever established between Saddam Hussein and al-Qaeda, but Iraq did not have weapons of mass destruction. And thus, today, most Americans and government officials believe the invasion of Iraq was a mistake and not worth it. Finally, when it comes to Syria, a few NATO nations do play a role in supporting rebels in the ongoing Syrian civil war against the Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad, who is supported by the Russian government, and he is known for having killed thousands of his own people and even used chemical weapons against them. So when given context, these NATO interventions are not quite the same as what is happening in Ukraine, and are certainly not being depicted in a historically accurate manner to Russians watching Russian government-controlled TV. And of course, given all the invasions Russia has taken part in over its history in recent years especially, certainly the Russian people are not given an accurate depiction on Russia's invasions in other places as well, as we're seeing today. Secondly, another popular claim in Russia is that the US lied about NATO expansion, and that the US had promised that NATO would not expand closer to Russia. However, there has never actually been any legal agreement that was signed to prevent NATO expansion. And there's also no reason for an alliance to let Russia, who is a foreign non-NATO nation, dictate who can or cannot be part of the NATO alliance. Obviously, that would kind of defeat the whole point of the alliance in the first place. Additionally, this is why the Russian government's request that Ukraine can never be part of NATO is not something anyone would ever consider accepting. And the Russian government knows its request is unrealistic also. And despite the increasing relationship with Ukraine and NATO nations, the Russian government also has to be well aware that NATO wouldn't allow Ukraine to join the alliance anyway, because of how much it would upset Russia, and because it could lead to a military conflict with Russia, which NATO doesn't want because Russia has nuclear weapons. And this is exactly why today, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, NATO nations have not gotten involved in the conflict. If NATO is really interested in having a conflict with Russia, Russia invading Ukraine would certainly cause NATO to get involved if NATO really wanted to, which they clearly don't because they don't want a nuclear war. Then the other false claim promoted on Russian media comes from the idea that the US has biological weapon labs in Ukraine to try and create some disease and use it against Russia. This claim is particularly absurd and has no evidence as well, not to mention that trying to create some type of biological weapon like that sounds like something more out of a science fiction movie and something that would be dangerous for even the US as well. So it doesn't make any sense in the first place. Finally, the last major popular conspiracy theory being promoted by the Russian government is that there's a genocide against Russian speakers in the Donbass region of Ukraine. However, not only is there no evidence of this, nor has any evidence been provided to the international community like the United Nations, but in reality, the exact opposite is happening, because as the Russian government's invasion of Ukraine goes on, it becomes clearer and clearer that what the Russian government is doing to Ukraine is actually genocide. Because right now, as you listen to this, we are witnessing the systematic destruction of Ukraine as a nation by the Russian government. And the Russian President Vladimir Putin has already said himself that Ukraine really isn't a country and should never have been made an independent nation. Ergo, there's no doubt that this is a genocide against Ukraine's existence as an independent nation of the world. And every day, the Russian government is bombing cities all over Ukraine and have already killed thousands of Ukrainians and caused over 1 million refugees. So here we are right now as the Russian government continues its genocide against Ukraine. Ukraine continues to fight back, with military aid being supplied from many nations and even thousands of volunteers from around the world coming to help defend Ukraine. And as each day passes, the war becomes harder and harder for Russia to win, because this was a conflict the Russian government had hoped would be a very quick victory for Russia. Instead, though, Russia greatly underestimated the Ukrainian resistance and has found itself kind of trapped in a military conflict it will never actually win, much like what happened when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, because the Ukrainian people refuse to be conquered. And each day this war goes on, Russia wastes more money and resources. And with its population already declining each year, Russia continues to lose young men every day in this conflict. In fact, the number of Russian soldiers who have died so far in this conflict is insanely high for a war, which has been only going on for about 2 weeks. Reports suggest several thousand Russian soldiers have already died, and the number just keeps going up. Yet, in true Soviet fashion, Russia has been reporting much fewer numbers in the international community to the Russian population back home. Also, not only does it appear that the Russian government has underestimated the Ukrainians, but Russia continues to have major logistical problems and morale problems in Ukraine, which suggests a climate in the Russian government where perhaps there is not much self-criticism and reflection towards Russia's military capabilities and planning, especially when you think about how much more powerful the Russian military is on paper. Recently, there have even been reports of Russian soldiers unaware that they were going to Ukraine to fight in the first place. So this war really has become a pretty hopeless mess for Russia and a nearly impossible task, even if they had more success than they are currently having, because you simply cannot conquer people who don't want you there. You can occupy their country, which would be extremely costly and drain resources, but people will continue to rise up and use guerrilla warfare tactics against the occupiers until they leave. And we see this time and time again historically. But this military conflict that Russia finds itself stuck in is only half the problem. The other issue for Russia is that its actions have resulted in a historic amount of economic sanctions and international backlash from all over the world, which has crushed the Russian economy. And on top of that, international companies are leaving Russia every day. And these economic issues, which will just get worse over time, are certainly bothering the Russian government and making the Russian people think, what on earth is going on here? Because literally, in the span of about a couple of weeks, Russia has gone from being a country with, certainly notable issues, but still being a globalized, powerful nation with many modern companies and brands, to literally being on the verge of becoming a North Korea-like nation due to a major miscalculation by the Russian government as to what the Ukrainians and international community would let them get away with. I mean, at the end of the day, your international reputation has hit an all-time low when at the United Nations, 141 countries vote to condemn you for your invasion of Ukraine, with only 35 countries abstaining and literally only 5 in support of you. And these countries that voted in support of Russia were places like North Korea and Iran, who are not exactly the nations that have the best international reputations for being friendly nations. In turn, now the Russian government finds itself in a major financial trouble and isolated internationally. So much so that the Russian government has resorted to creating a list of what they deem as unfriendly nations, trying to get revenge sort of for being internationally scolded for this. And on this list include various democracies around the world, and as well as historically neutral Switzerland. If you have issues with Switzerland, that's also a pretty bad sign. Additionally, Putin has now started making coded threats of nuclear war against any nation that interferes in the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which is also something that you would expect more from Kim Jong-un, the dictator of North Korea. So that's another disturbing thing that has happened recently. With that being said, though, these nuclear threats also reminds us of the dangers of when authoritarian governments possess nuclear weapons, because they can use their nuclear arsenals as a way of scaring the world away while they try to conquer another nation. Therefore, it's hard to know how this all ends, though regardless of what happens, the costs have already been enormous for Ukraine, but they've also been huge for the Russian government as well. And as long as this war continues, both nations will suffer. Therefore, the Russian government may have thought they could just conquer Ukraine without much damage, but instead they have shot themselves in the foot and robbed not only many Ukrainians of a peaceful and prosperous future in the near term, but also their own people as well. It is a really disturbing and sad situation right now, because things didn't have to be this way. But because of one ruler's thirst for conquest, 2 nations now face major problems for the foreseeable future. I mean, when you think historically, the Russian government's genocide in Ukraine will be viewed in the 21st century much like Nazi Germany was viewed during the decades following World War II. And it will be a reputational problem that will take a long time for Russia to fix. Therefore, hopefully, together as an international community, we can work together to solve this historic crisis, which will be remembered as a defining tragedy of the 21st century, by helping rebuild and provide a future for Ukraine and those Ukrainians that have lost nearly everything. Because how the world responds today will make history. In fact, each action, big or small, by every single person that is alive today witnessing what's happening will be a part of the global historic archives on the events in Ukraine. And right now, as a global society, together, we are writing the pages of the history books of tomorrow. The question is, what will those pages say about how the world responded to this ongoing horrific event? At the same time, though, it is also important that the world remembers and keeps in mind that this invasion is the Russian government's invasion, not the Russian people. Like all wars in history, things are not black and white. They are complex, and there are many Russians out there who don't want this war, much like the majority of the world. Thus, it is important that we don't discriminate against Russian people or Russian culture for the Russian government's actions, because this only helps the Russian government isolate its own people from the rest of the world and helps the Russian government promote the false idea that they can only protect the Russian people while the rest of the world is evil and anti-Russian. Therefore, if Russians who don't support this war are not given compassion, then it helps the Russian government narrative promoting this Russian victimhood and identity politics on Russian media, which creates this authoritarian nationalism in the first place. So the international community must make sure to blame the Russian government for the invasion and not the Russian people. Lastly, in light of reports of discrimination towards non-ethnic Ukrainians trying to flee the nation at the border, the international community also needs to do a better job of making sure that all people are being helped to get out of Ukraine who are trying to get out. Thus, overall, during these tragic times we live in, we must remember that bad things will always happen in our world. But history teaches us that human societies can always rebuild and make things even better than they once were. And together, we will do it again. May the victims of this tragedy rest in peace. And as always, remember, billions of years led to you. So make the most of it.